Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a topic that's been bubbling away on the geopolitical and economic surface for months now. And now it's really reaching a critical boiling point. It's July 31st, 2025. And as we speak, a monumental showdown is unfolding in a Washington, D.C. federal appeals court. This isn't just some routine legal thing. It's happening just hours before President Trump's sweeping Liberation Day tariffs are set to take full effect globally. The clock is ticking quite literally on a decision that's going to reshape global trade.
That's absolutely right. These tariffs first unveiled with quite a bit of fanfare back on April 2nd. That's the day the president called Liberation Day, remember? They were initially meant for a really quick implementation, but then they got delayed, first by 90 days and then again. It gave businesses this, brief, probably pretty frantic window to adjust. Now, that window is basically slamming shut. We're staring down an August 1st deadline for most countries. China gets a little bit longer, until August 12th. But yeah, the stakes just couldn't be higher. We're talking impacts on global trade flows, these really intricate supply chains, and, directly hitting the wallets of consumers and business profit margins too.
Right. So our mission today, then, is to try and untangle these complex layers. We've gone through a pretty robust stack of expert analyses from a diverse range of sources. We've got detailed economic modeling from Charles Schwab, deep fiscal projections from the Tax Foundation, geopolitical insights from Al Jazeera, and those sharp market assessments from J.P. Morgan Global Research. We'll explore the high-stakes legal challenges to these tariffs, dissect the actual rates, who they're designed to affect, and then trace the economic ripple effects, both here in the U.S. and across the international landscape. And crucially, we'll also look at how different nations are, strategically navigating this whole new trade environment.
And we won't just stop at the immediate impact, right? We'll also analyze how markets have reacted, both in the short term, where, we've actually seen some surprising resilience, and what might be expected down the line. We'll dig into why these current market highs might seem, paradoxical given the impending tariffs, and what future growth trajectories look like. So what is this intricate interplay of legal challenges, economic policy, global reactions? What does it truly mean for the global economy, and maybe more importantly for you, our well-informed listener? Let's dive deep. The legal gauntlet, challenging presidential tariff authority.
Okay, let's unpack this legal drama first. I mean, we're right on the edge of these tariffs taking full effect, and yet there's this massive legal challenge playing out, right now, in real time. On one side, you've got the Trump administration. They're asserting this broad, almost unprecedented authority to impose these duties, their justification. They're citing specific national emergencies. But on the other side, this unlikely but pretty formidable alliance has popped up, a collection of small business importers, many facing existential threats from these tariffs. And they're joined by no less than a dozen U.S. states. They're challenging that very presidential power in court. It's a classic separation of powers showdown, really, testing the boundaries of executive authority in a truly profound way.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is the core of their argument. It really hinges on a specific, maybe somewhat obscure piece of legislation, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, or IEEPA. Came in back in 1977. Now, this act grants the president significant power to regulate international commerce. But, and this is the crucial bit, only after declaring a national emergency. The challengers, they aren't necessarily disputing that the emergencies the president declared exist, the flow of illegal fentanyl, illegal immigration. Instead, what they're questioning is whether those particular emergencies truly fall under let's say, the intent or the spirit of IEEPA. To justify such sweeping, broad economic measures like these universal tariffs.
Right. And even if we say, okay, those are legitimate emergencies, the challenges are taking it a step further, aren't they? They're asking, are these Liberation Day tariffs, which hit nearly all imports, tons of different goods, metals, pharma, everything, are I the type of regulation Congress actually intended when they wrote IEPA to address those specific issues? It's a really nuanced legal interpretation, isn't it? Digging deep into the spirit versus the letter of the law, they seem to be arguing IEPA was meant more for targeted sanctions, right? Financial stuff, or direct national security threats, not as this kind of blanket authority for huge economic policy changes that affect, pretty much every sector. This whole debate, it really tests the limits of presidential power under emergencies, could have long-lasting effects.
Indeed. It's a critical distinction, and one that, previous administrations have also grappled with, though maybe not quite on this scale. And just to add another layer of complexity to this legal saga, a lower court, the U.S. Court of International Trade, actually struck down these tariffs back in May, ruled them unlawful. That ruling covered both the Liberation Day, reciprocal tariffs, and those drug trafficking tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico. However, that ruling was quickly put on hold, stayed basically, pending this very Federal Circuit Court of Appeals decision we're talking about today. And the critical point for businesses, for consumers, is this. Despite the ongoing legal fight, despite the lower court saying they were unlawful, this appeals court decision is not expected before that August 1st deadline, which means for all practical purposes, the tariffs will likely kick in tomorrow, at least for now, leaving businesses to operate under this, big cloud of legal uncertainty.
Wow. So the legal battle just keeps grinding through the courts, maybe for months, maybe years. But the economic reality starts tomorrow, no matter what the judges decide right now. You can just imagine the uncertainty for businesses trying to plan supply chains, pricing, nightmare. And the challengers, they've even pointed to a really recent Supreme Court decision, right? FCC v. Consumers Research from June, arguing it strengthens their case about Congress delegating authority. They're basically saying Congress meant to give away much less power than the administration is claiming under IEPA. It's almost like saying Congress gave them a wrench for tightening bolts, but they're using it like a hammer to build a whole house.
Precisely. That analogy, it really captures the core of their argument. It questions legislative intent, the scope of executive discretion. And this brings us to a really fascinating economic what if. If these IEPA tariffs were actually stopped because of a successful legal challenge, J.P. Morgan Global Research estimated the effective U.S. tariff rate would fall dramatically, like from maybe 13–14% down to roughly 5%. That would be a truly huge shift. It could potentially lead to a material upgrade in global growth forecasts, and maybe even a reduction in core CPI, that's the Consumer Price Index, by close to a whole percentage point. And just for context, a 1 percentage point cut in core CPI, that's substantial. It measures inflation without volatile food and energy. It would mean a massive relief for central banks, for consumers.
That's a huge potential impact right there, almost like a sneak peek of what could happen if the courts step in.
Absolutely. But it's also really important to remember that the administration has other ways to impose tariffs. They have other channels, like Section 232, which covers national security for specific industries, remember the steel and aluminum ones, or Section 301, dealing with unfair trade practices often used against China. This just shows that tariffs aren't just a one-off measure for them. They seem to be a central, kind of deeply embedded part of this administration's economic and foreign policy playbook. So even if this particular legal route via IEPA gets shut down, the administration could, and probably would, look for other legal ways to get tariffs in place, which suggests that this overall tariff-heavy landscape might just stick around for a while, deconstructing the Liberation Day tariffs, scope and scale.
Okay, let's pivot then. From the intricate legal maze to the practical reality of these new tariffs, what exactly are these Liberation Day tariffs beyond the name? What kind of rates are we actually talking about? How far-reaching are they? Which goods, which countries?
Right. So these tariffs, like you said, first announced April 2nd, Liberation Day. And the timeline itself tells a story about the uncertainty around them. Initially set to start just a week later, April 9th, then delayed 90 days, then delayed again to August 1st for most countries. China got that slight extension, August 12th. Now, these delays, they probably caused massive planning headaches for businesses, but they did give some companies a brief, maybe frantic window to adjust supply chains. We saw a lot of what's called early buying, front-loading imports to try and keep inventory costs down before the higher duties hit, and strategically rethinking where they get their stuff from. It must have been a period of intense last-minute scrambling in boardrooms everywhere.
And from the administration side, what are the driving forces here? It feels like it's not just about simple trade deficits, is it? There seems to be more going on.
That's a really crucial observation. Officially, the administration justifies these new rates as necessary to fix what they see as large U.S. trade deficits with many countries, with the goal being to boost U.S. manufacturing, create jobs here. Although, it's worth pointing out, most economists would say trade deficits aren't necessarily direct proof of unfair trade. They can come from broader macroeconomic stuff, like different savings and investment rates between countries, or just a strong economy pulling in imports. But what's really fascinating, I think, is how the Trump administration is also using these tariff threats for, broader non-economic agendas. They're using them as pretty powerful diplomatic tools, leverage points, for trying to curb illegal immigration at the southern border, for combating the fentanyl crisis by targeting source countries, and even for pressing allies on geopolitical issues.
Can you give us an example of that, the geopolitical leverage?
Sure. Take India. Despite, strong diplomatic ties on paper, the administration has used tariff threats to push back on India's significant energy deals with Russia or Brazil. The tariffs there are being publicly linked to the legal action against former President Jair Bolsonaro, who President Trump publicly supports. So it shows these tariffs aren't purely economic tools. They're kind of multifaceted instruments woven into their bigger foreign and domestic policy strategy. Creates this really complex web of reasons for putting them in place.
Okay, so it's a mix. Economic goals, geopolitical leverage, makes them much more than just simple trade taxes. But let's get down to the numbers. What's the actual magnitude of these tariffs?
This is where it gets really interesting, right? Especially that historical comparison. Yeah, the scale's pretty staggering. According to the Tax Foundation, the average U.S. effective tariff rate, which is already around 2.5% in 2024, could jump to a massive 18.8% without any changes in behavior from businesses or consumers. Even if people adjust, it's projected to hit 12.9%. Now, to put that in historical context, this would push the average tariff rate on all imports to levels we haven't seen since the 1940s. We're talking the Smoot-Hawley era, the immediate post-World War II period. We are genuinely approaching some of the highest rates in U.S. history. It's a profound reversal of decades of trade liberalization. And J.P. Morgan Global Research, back in April, they calculated that the sweeping tariffs first enacted on April 3rd would take the average effective rate from around 10% to just over 23%. And this isn't just tweaking things. It's fundamentally rethinking America's whole trade stance.
Wow, that's a dramatic jump. Signals a real fundamental shift. The Tax Foundation even called Trump's 2025 tariffs potentially the largest tax hike since 1993, projecting them to be, 0.63% of GDP? That's comparable to that big 1993 Budget Act. Yeah, we're clearly not talking minor tweaks here. These are potentially monumental, huge economic implications.
Precisely. These aren't surgical strikes. They're broad economic shifts. And in terms of the specific rates kicking in August 1st, they'll range from 15% up to 50%, maybe even higher. Depends on the trading partner, depends on the goods. For instance, a really substantial 50% tariff is going on critical industrial stuff like copper, steel, and aluminum for most countries. That effectively doubles the old 25% Section 232 tariffs on those metals. Big cost increase. Meanwhile, a 20% levy is going on pharmaceutical products, a sector vital for public health. And some pharma tariffs could even be delayed, maybe 12 to 18 months, but then hit at rates as high as 200%. That creates this long period of uncertainty, potential price shocks in healthcare, this kind of tiered approach with certain sectors facing much higher duties, different timelines. It just adds layers of complexity for businesses trying to figure this all out. It's not a uniform wall. It's more like a very specialized, targeted set of barriers.
Who wins, who loses in the U.S. and beyond?
Okay, this brings us to a really crucial question. Who actually ends up paying for these tariffs? The administration consistently says foreign producers will eat the cost, right? Making their stuff less competitive here, helping U.S. industries. But we've seen evidence suggesting otherwise in past trade disputes. Is that narrative that foreign companies pay really holding up?
Yeah, this is one of the most hotly debated parts of tariffs, isn't it? But the consensus from, the vast majority of economic analyses, J.P. Morgan, Tax Foundation, academic studies is pretty clear. Tariffs are fundamentally a tax on imports. And the burden, it almost always falls disproportionately on domestic sellers and, crucially, U.S. consumers. Sure, foreign producers might absorb some costs, especially short-term, to try and keep market share, avoid losing customers. But usually the bulk gets passed on. And the data, it absolutely supports this. U.S. Customs and Border Protection reported a, frankly, staggering 131% rise in customs duties collected through July 24th this year, compared to the same time last year. That huge increase strongly suggests it's U.S. companies and, by extension, U.S. consumers footing the bill. I mean, if foreign producers were just absorbing it all, we wouldn't see such a massive surge in duties collected right here at the U.S. border. The money's coming from American importers.
And what about the direct, tangible impact on American households? Beyond the abstract economic figures, what does this actually mean for people's wallets day to day?
Well, the Yale Budget Lab, they're a nonpartisan policy research center. They recently put out a very concrete estimate. They reckon these overseas trade tariffs could cost U.S. households, on average, an extra $2,400 in 2025. And that's not just a number, right? That translates directly to higher prices on, everything from your new fridge to the clothes you buy. It basically acts like a hidden sales tax on imported goods. That's a significant chunk out of any household budget. Could really erode spending power. And this lines up pretty well with J.P. Morgan's estimate, too. They figured the new reciprocal tariffs, if fully passed through, could add about 0.4 percentage points to the PCE price level. That's the inflation measure the Fed watches closely. Even if companies absorb some of it, which they call margin compression, the more likely estimate is still a notable 0.2 to 0.3 percentage points. So this direct hit on consumer prices means the purchasing power of your dollar just diminishes, makes everything from abroad more expensive.
Wow, that's a really significant hit to household budgets. especially when inflation's already a concern for so many people. What about the broader economic indicators? Beyond just consumer costs, how might this ripple through the whole U.S. economy?
The Tax Foundation's preliminary estimates, they paint a pretty stark picture. If all the proposed tariffs are fully implemented, they could lead to a substantial 0.8% reduction in U.S. GDP over the next decade. That's not a minor blip, that's a significant, persistent drag on overall economic output. And they estimate the loss of 741,000 full-time equivalent jobs over that same period. Those job losses would probably hit industries that rely heavily on imports hardest: retail, manufacturing using foreign parts, logistics. JP Morgan also revised down U.S. GDP growth to just 1.3% for the year, partly blaming that slowdown on this heightened trade policy uncertainty and the drag from existing tariffs. They also noted that 0.2 percentage point bump to headline inflation, reinforcing the idea these tariffs push prices up. So yeah, these aren't minor adjustments. They represent material changes to the economic outlook, a significant headwind.
So we're talking tariffs potentially squeezing consumer spending, hitting business confidence hard, and even directly impacting jobs. It sounds like a complex kind of cascading effect across the whole economy.
Absolutely. JP Morgan's observed that U.S. business sentiment, which had initially surged after the election, is now distinctly depressed by all this tariff uncertainty. And this isn't just feelings. This uncertainty directly weighs on spending and hiring decisions. Businesses delay investments, hold off on expansion plans, maybe even pause everyday operational choices because the trade environment is so unpredictable. And they expect this slide to actually accelerate, especially as the initial post-election boost fades. The hit to purchasing power that comes from higher import prices. That could even push real disposable personal income growth into negative territory in Q2 and Q3 this year. And with that, there's a significant risk that real consumer spending actually contracts in those quarters. And consumer spending is, a huge driver of the U.S. economy. This creates a deeply challenging dilemma for the Federal Reserve. They have to balance their job of controlling inflation with the potential for the job market weakening and the economy slowing down. It's a very, very difficult tightrope walk for monetary policy. And tariffs just add another layer of complexity to their decisions.
What's really fascinating here, though, is this delayed impact we seem to be seeing. Charles Schwab points out that the tariffs already in place haven't shown a huge impact on inflation, global growth, or company earnings yet. It seems like there have been some mitigating factors, right? Cushioning the immediate blow. Could you elaborate on those?
Yeah, you've hit on a crucial point there. Several things have indeed softened the immediate upfront impact. First, there was significant early buying. Businesses front-loaded imports before the deadlines hit to keep inventory costs lower. And consumers, maybe anticipating price hikes, also pulled forward some spending. Second, many companies have been absorbing some of these price increases themselves, either because they couldn't immediately pass them on without losing customers, or maybe as a strategic move, waiting for more certainty on where tariffs will finally land. Some big multinational companies might even be spreading cost increases across their global operations, not just hitting U.S. prices. However, the consensus among economists is that the full effect is widely believed to be still coming. It just takes time for tariffs to flow through the whole supply chain, from raw materials to finished goods, and fully show up in inflation numbers. For instance, the effective U.S. tariff rate at the end of May was only 8.8%, according to the U.S. International Trade Commission, much lower than these proposed Liberation Day rates. But that massive 131% rise in customs duties collected through July 24th, compared to last year, that strongly indicates U.S. companies and consumers are already shouldering a big part of the cost. So the economic hit, yeah, it's delayed, not averted. It's like a slow-burning fuse, really. A shifting global chessboard. Deals, delays, and diversification.
Okay, so the August 1st deadline is basically here. And President Trump has been absolutely clear about no extensions. He even posted on Truth Social, didn't he, something like, the August 1st deadline is the August 1st deadline. It stands strong and will not be extended. A big day for America. So, with that pretty definitive statement hanging in the air, who's managed to play their cards right? Who secured a deal with the US and who's still scrambling as the clock ticks down tonight?
It's a really complex, rapidly shifting picture. Like a global chessboard, truly, with every nation making strategic moves. Many countries have been, strong-armed into new deals. These deals typically involve accepting higher U.S. tariffs than before, and this is key, lower than those initially threatened Liberation Day rates. In exchange, they keep market access and often make significant investment commitments or other concessions. Take the European Union, for example, major U.S. trading partner. They agreed to a 15% tariff on most of their goods, including cars, pharmaceuticals. That's a big reduction from the threatened 30%, which would have been devastating for European industries. But the deal also includes commitments from the EU to buy more U.S. liquefied natural gas, increase investments here. Although steel and aluminum will still get hit with that higher 50% rate, it really shows a kind of strategic capitulation by the EU to avoid a full trade war. Highlights the pressure even big economies face. Japan also got a deal, 15% reciprocal tariff on its exports here, down from a potential 25%, but that came in exchange for a massive $550 billion investment pledge in the U.S. economy. A clear example of economic diplomacy.
And what about other major trading partners? Beyond those big economic powers, similar kinds of concessions.
Absolutely. The UK, for instance, agreed to a 10% general tariff rate on its exports here. That's lower than many others. They also got a 25% rate on steel and aluminum, which is half the 50% others face. Suggests maybe some preferential treatment linked to the special relationship. South Korea secured a lower 15% tariff on its imports to the U.S., but in return, they made a huge $350 billion investment pledge and agreed to zero tariffs on specific U.S. exports like cars and farm goods. Indonesia negotiated 19% on its exports, down from a threatened 32%. Wow. By committing to buy U.S. Boeing aircraft and reducing its own trade barriers. Vietnam agreed to 20% on most exports, way below the 46% announced on Liberation Day. But goods just passing through Vietnam could face 40%. Plus, they agreed to zero tariffs on some U.S. imports, like big cars. The Philippines also got 19% on its exports, with zero tariffs on U.S. exports going there, plus enhanced military cooperation commitments. Even Pakistan apparently struck a deal to jointly develop oil reserves with the U.S., though the specific tariff rates are less clear there. These bilateral deals, they really show this pattern of quid pro quo. Tariff relief is granted, but usually in exchange for economic or strategic concessions.
Wow, that's a dizzying amount of deal-making. Different outcomes, different trade-offs. But what's the situation for the U.S.'s top three trading partners? Mexico, Canada, China. Have they managed to get lasting agreements? Or are they still kind of in the crosshairs?
Unfortunately for them, no. None of the top three, Mexico, Canada, China, have permanent deals locked in for August 1st. Mexico, currently the U.S.'s top trade partner, they're facing existing 25% tariffs on most imports from earlier 2025 measures. Only some exemptions are left under the USMCA agreement, and negotiations have been really difficult, often tied to immigration issues. Canada, number 2 trade partner, is now threatened with a 35% tariff on goods that don't comply with USMCA since no deal was done by the deadline. That could seriously disrupt those deeply integrated cross-border supply chains. And China, ranking 3rd, they have that temporary pause until August 12th, but still face a 30% combined tariff. And that followed those earlier really dramatic escalations, 145%, even 104% on some goods, with China retaliating, shows just how volatile and unresolved that relationship is. These 3 relationships alone, they represent a massive chunk of U.S. trade. And their unresolved status just injects huge uncertainty into the global economic outlook.
What about countries still hoping for a last-minute deal, maybe right up to the wire today? Any movement there?
Well, India is a key example still in really intense negotiations. Despite what's been called a very good friendship with Washington, India is facing a sweeping 25% tariff on all its goods exported here, plus that unspecified penalty for buying significant amounts of energy from Russia. Trump publicly criticized India's high tariffs too, right? Said on Truth Social, "While India is our friend, we have done relatively little business with them because their tariffs are far too high." Mahal suggests the U.S. is pushing hard for more market access in India. Taiwan, critical for semiconductors, also in intense talks, facing a proposed 32% tariff if no deal is struck by today. Taiwanese officials have apparently had 4 high-level rounds of talks covering tariffs, non-tariff barriers, investments, market access. Sounds like a comprehensive, really urgent effort to get a deal, but reports say it's all still pending U.S. approval, adds to the 11th hour suspense.
And on the flip side, who has basically little hope for a deal? Or maybe has already been dealt the toughest hand?
Brazil, unfortunately, seems to face the most punishing tariffs among major U.S. trading partners. President Trump formally issued a 50% reciprocal tariff on Brazilian imports effective August 1st. That move, announced July 10th, is publicly linked by Trump himself to the prosecution of former President Jair Bolsonaro. Trump called him a Trump ally, described his trial as a witch hunt, an international disgrace. This explicit political link makes it really challenging for Brazil. It frames the economic measure as a tool of political pressure. And even though the U.S. actually runs a trade surplus with Brazil, Brazil's government reacted with alarm. President Lula called Trump's measures economic blackmail. Negotiations have reportedly stalled, leaves them with little immediate hope for a better outcome. It's a really stark example of how geopolitics is overtly shaping trade policy here. And, beyond the immediate deals and deadlines, we're seeing this significant, maybe even historic shift in global trade strategy. Countries are actively trying to diversify to get away from relying too heavily on the U.S. market or really any single trading partner. The data's already showing it. China's exports to ASEAN, that's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, rose a big 17% in June, while its exports to the U.S. reportedly fell 16.1% in the same month. That's real-time diversification happening, and there's this flurry of new free trade deals emerging globally. The UK and India made a historic deal in May. Canada and the 10 ASEAN countries are actively pursuing one. Mexico and Brazil are working to deepen their own regional trade agreement. China signed dozens of cooperation agreements with Vietnam and Malaysia in April, got zero tariff access for 53 African countries in June, looking to strengthen its deal with ASEAN by October. The EU is also working on closer trade ties with India, South Africa, countries across Asia, maybe a free trade deal with Indonesia by September. Now, this might help reduce the impact of U.S. tariffs, giving countries alternative markets, new trade routes. But the U.S. market is just so huge, its consumers so numerous, it's unlikely to be a perfect offset, especially short to medium term. The long-term implication, though, potentially reshaping the whole global trading system, moving away from a U.S.-centric model. Market responses and future outlook.
Okay, so with all this uncertainty, the new tariffs kicking in, these global shifts, how have the markets actually reacted? And what's the outlook? It seems almost, well, paradoxical that global stock markets are near record highs despite rising tariffs and all these looming economic worries. What explains this apparent disconnect between the headlines and market performance?
That's a great observation. And it's a question a lot of investors, a lot of analysts are grappling with right now. Charles Schwab notes that global stock markets are indeed near their highest levels for the year. They actually reversed the losses that followed those initial Liberation Day announcements back in April. They suggest this resilience is partly because, for many countries, exports to the U.S. are actually a relatively small slice of their overall GDP. For example, China's exports to the U.S. only 2.3% of its GDP in 2024. In fact, only 7 countries have goods export exposure to the U.S. market that's over 10% of their GDP. So this limited exposure on a macro level might lessen the perceived immediate hit for some economies, suggest tariffs aren't an existential threat for everyone. Plus, markets are always forward-looking, right? Investors are likely anticipating when this period of uncertainty might fade. When global growth could improve again, maybe looking out to 2026 for a clearer picture. There seems to be this underlying belief that trade flows will eventually adapt, or maybe policy will shift again.
But J.P. Morgan Global Research still warns of significant economic impact, despite this current market resilience, right? It sounds like they're painting a much gloomier picture for the real economy, kind of separating that from current market sentiment.
Yes, absolutely. JP Morgan paints a far starker picture of the underlying economic consequences than the buoyant stock market might suggest. They estimate that a universal 10% tariff combined with a 110% tariff on China, which is a significant escalation from where we are now, quanticho, could reduce global GDP by a substantial 1%. And they warn that potential spillovers like negative sentiment shocks or financial market disruptions could even double that drag, leading to a 2% hit to global GDP. They also forecast global real GDP growth to slow significantly, down to 1.4% in the fourth quarter of 2025. That's a notable drop from 2.1% at the start of the year. They're already expecting recessions in Canada and Mexico, 2 countries with really high export exposure to the U.S. and direct tariff hits. And JP Morgan has also made modest downgrades for growth forecasts in Europe and emerging Asia, reflects the broad reach of these policies. So yeah, while markets might be resilient for now, the underlying economic data points to significant headwinds ahead.
And what about specific sectors? Which industries are particularly vulnerable to these new rates, feeling the direct heat?
Well, the auto sector, for one. It faces a potential 25% tariff on imports. JP Morgan estimates this could raise U.S. light vehicle prices by as much as 11.4% on average. Just think about that. For a, say, $40,000 new car, that's an extra $4,560. That would put significant pressure on all automakers, foreign and domestic, who rely on global supply chains. And it would inevitably affect consumer choices, maybe reducing overall car sales, maybe pushing buyers towards cheaper models. The metals markets are also getting hit hard. Those 50% aluminum tariffs, for instance. They've apparently utterly paralyzed the U.S. Midwest premium market. The MWP. Now, this premium, it's not just some fancy term. It's the crucial added cost on top of the global benchmark price for aluminum delivered specifically to the U.S. Midwest. Reflects regional demand, transport, storage costs. When it's paralyzed, it means the normal price signals have just broken down. Creates immense uncertainty for manufacturers who need aluminum. Current spot prices are barely high enough to cover the tariff alone. Makes it economically unviable to import aluminum into the U.S., which paradoxically encourages shippers who have flexibility to send aluminum elsewhere, like Europe, where prices might be better, instead of to U.S. factories. directly hits the competitiveness of American manufacturers. Copper prices also surged when the 50% tariff was announced, though J.P. Morgan, while acknowledging that surge, is cautiously forecasting London Metal Exchange copper prices to slide towards $9,100 per metric ton in Q3, before maybe stabilizing around $9,350 in Q4, reflects the ongoing volatility as the market tries to find a new balance.
Okay. So, despite the current market resilience, despite some countries managing to get deals, the potential for a significant economic hit seems to be delayed, not averted. It's like a slow-moving but powerful force, just waiting to fully show itself.
That's precisely the key insight, I think. The economic impact is still in motion, just not fully realized yet. Prices in the U.S. could rise substantially as companies keep passing on those costs, could lead to a broader inflationary environment. Conversely, overseas prices for certain goods might actually fall if other countries don't retaliate with their own tariffs. Creates this global imbalance. U.S. consumers pay more, foreign producers potentially get less. While Charles Schwab believes a global recession isn't likely, global growth is widely expected to slow down in 2025, before maybe re-accelerating in 2026, especially if trade and tariff uncertainty eases up. The International Monetary Fund, indirectly referring to the Trump administration and its policies, has explicitly called for an end to the trade war, to restore stability, reduce policy uncertainty, urging clear, predictable frameworks to support the global trading system. The full economic picture is going to continue to unfold as these tariffs become more entrenched and the global economy adapts, or struggles to adapt, to this new reality. Key takeaways and final thoughts.
We've really navigated some turbulent waters today, haven't we? Covering this complex situation. We started with that high-stakes legal battle over presidential tariff power, then explored the immense scale, the specific rates of these Liberation Day tariffs, dug into their far-reaching economic consequences for U.S. businesses, households, and finally looked at that intricate, sometimes chaotic dance of international negotiations, the deals, the delays, the diversification efforts worldwide.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here, maybe the most important takeaway, is this persistent tension between the immediate market reactions, which have shown this surprising, almost counterintuitive resilience, and the delayed yet potentially profound economic impacts that are projected to ripple through the global economy. This market paradox, it reveals something crucial, I think. Markets often price in a return to normal before the full disruption even hits. Investors might be betting on eventual policy clarity or a structural shift in supply chains, rather than just reacting to the immediate shocks. And while some countries have secured deals, many major trading partners are still without resolution. That leads to ongoing uncertainty and this fundamental reshuffling of global supply chains. The historical context to these tariffs hitting levels not seen in decades, it just underlines the sheer magnitude of this shift in U.S. trade policy.
And we shouldn't forget the legal side either. That fundamental challenge to IEPA. The question of how national emergencies justify such broad economic measures. That's still unresolved. It creates this lingering judicial uncertainty that complicates the future of these policies, could still dramatically change the landscape later on, even as the tariffs kick in tomorrow. It's like a legal sword of Damocles hanging over everything.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that accelerating shift towards countries diversifying trade away from the U.S., pursuing their own regional or bilateral deals, that could fundamentally reshape global trade dynamics for years to come, regardless of the U.S. tariff outcome. It's kind of fostering a more multipolar trade world. The economic hit from these tariffs, it's still coming, even if it's delayed. And the full magnitude, its impact on global growth, inflation, jobs, it's still very much unfolding. It's like a real-time experiment in global economic reengineering.
So what does this all mean for you, our informed listener? As these tariffs take full effect, the key will be to, keenly observe how businesses adapt, their supply chains, their pricing strategies, how consumers respond to potential price increases on everyday stuff, and how the legal and geopolitical landscape keeps evolving in response to these, frankly, unprecedented measures. This situation, it isn't just about trade numbers or economic forecasts. It's about the fundamental structure of global commerce, the powers that shape it, and how your daily life might be subtly, or maybe not so subtly, affected.
Yeah, it raises a really important question for all of us to think about. How resilient is the global trading system really to sustain unilateral tariff actions like this? And what are the long-term implications for economic interdependence, for the stability of international relations if this trend keeps going? Something to definitely consider as we watch this whole story unfold.
Ouch. And that wraps up another deep dive into the complexities of our world. We really hope this exploration of the Liberation Day tariffs has given you a clearer, maybe more nuanced understanding of the forces at play and what might be coming next.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay informed. We look forward to our next session.